The night air is sharp and still. Snow creaks under boots. Somewhere in the dark, artillery thumps like a slow heartbeat. Men huddle inside shattered buildings, counting bullets, counting hours, counting breaths. Supplies are gone. Radios crackle with bad news. Retreat would mean survival. But the order that arrives is clear, cold, and final. Hold the city, at all costs. You can almost feel the weight of that sentence pressing down on every man who hears it. In that moment, the city stops being a place on a map and becomes a cage. And the question hangs in the frozen air, unanswered and terrifying. Why would anyone demand this, even when there is no food, no fuel, and no hope of relief? If you want more content like this, subscribe now and comment below. This story begins not with a single battle, but with a way of thinking. Adolf Hitler did not see cities the way his generals did. To trained officers, a city was a tactical point, useful only as long as it could be supplied and defended. To Hitler, cities became symbols. They were proof of will, proof of destiny, proof that retreat was weakness and holding ground was strength. From the earliest days of the war, he believed that giving up territory shattered morale more than losing armies. In his mind, once you surrendered a city, you invited collapse everywhere else. So he began to issue orders that shocked even his most loyal commanders. No withdrawals, no flexibility, no surrender. Hold fast even if the city starves. In September 1939, during the invasion of Poland, this mindset was already visible. German units pushed fast and deep, but when resistance stiffened in certain towns, Hitler demanded they be taken and held immediately. Speed mattered, but symbolism mattered more. He watched maps obsessively, marking cities like prizes. Each captured urban centre was announced as a victory of will, not just arms. The pattern hardened as the war expanded. In France in 1940, rapid movement won the campaign, but Hitler took a dangerous lesson from success. He believed boldness alone broke enemies. Logistics, in his mind, followed victory, not the other way around. By 1941, when German forces crossed into the Soviet Union, this belief had become rigid doctrine. Cities like Minsk, Smolensk, and Kiev were not just objectives, they were anchors. Hitler feared that if German troops pulled back even slightly, Soviet forces would flood forward and erase every gain. He ignored warnings from his generals about distance, roads, fuel, and weather. When supply lines stretched thin, he did not see a problem to solve. He saw a test of will. If soldiers held firm, he believed, somehow the situation would correct itself. As autumn turned to winter in 1941, the cost of this thinking became impossible to hide. German troops outside Moscow froze in place. Fuel trucks stalled. Ammunition ran low. Men wrapped rags around their boots. Field commanders begged for permission to pull back to defensible winter positions. They argued that a short withdrawal could save entire armies. Hitler refused. On December 8, 1941, he issued a sweeping order forbidding any retreat without his personal approval. Cities, towns, and even small villages were to be held as fortresses. Supply or no supply, they would stand. This was not only military stubbornness, it was personal fear. Hitler believed retreat would shatter the myth of German invincibility. He feared that once soldiers learned they could fall back, discipline would crumble. He had studied the collapse of Imperial Germany in 1918 and convinced himself it began with small withdrawals and loss of nerve. To him, holding ground was psychological warfare against both enemy and self. If German troops suffered but did not break, he believed the enemy would lose heart first. Nowhere did this belief become more deadly than in the city that would define the war on the Eastern Front, Stalingrad. In the summer of 1942, German forces advanced toward the Volga River. Stalingrad was not essential for supply at first. Its factories were damaged, its port limited. But its name carried weight. A city bearing Stalin's name became a personal challenge. Hitler fixated on it. When German units reached the outskirts in September, and the fighting turned brutal, street by street, room by room. Supply lines narrowed as the Red Army counterattacked from the flanks. By November 1942, the German Sixth Army was surrounded. Encirclement was confirmed. Food and ammunition dwindled. Generals argued that a breakout was still possible. The window was closing, but it was not closed. Hitler refused to hear it. He ordered the city held. He promised air supply that could never meet demand. To him, abandoning Stalingrad was unthinkable. It would be seen as defeat, not maneuver. And defeat, in his worldview, was contagious. Inside the pocket, reality told a different story. Horses were slaughtered for meat. Wounded men froze to death without bandages. Fuel for vehicles was gone, so artillery pieces became static tombs. Yet the order did not change. Hold at all costs. And the city had become a symbol far greater than the army trapped inside it. When the Sixth Army finally collapsed in February 1943, the loss was catastrophic. But even then, Hitler did not fully abandon the belief that had destroyed it. After Stalingrad, the German strategic situation worsened rapidly. Allied bombing devastated industry. The Eastern Front bled manpower at a terrifying rate. Yet Hitler doubled down. He began declaring more and more cities as fortresses. These places were to be defended to the last man, regardless of supply or strategic value. The idea was simple in his mind. Fortresses would tie down enemy forces, slow advances, and buy time for miracles. He believed time itself was a weapon. In reality, these fortress orders often achieved the opposite. Cities like Kharkov, Orel, Kharkiv, and later places in Italy and France became death traps. Garrison troops were cut off, surrounded, and destroyed or captured. Supplies ran out exactly as predicted. But Hitler saw each loss not as proof of a flawed strategy, but as proof that commanders had lacked faith or resolve. Instead of adjusting policy, he blamed individuals. This blame culture reinforced the problem. Generals became afraid to suggest withdrawal. Reports were softened. Bad news was delayed. Hitler's headquarters became an echo chamber where optimism replaced accuracy. When cities were threatened, the default response was always the same: hold, dig in, fight. Even when rail lines were cut, when fuel dumps were destroyed, when airfields were overrun, the order did not change. By 1944, as Allied forces landed in Normandy, this mindset reached Western Europe. German commanders understood that mobile defence was essential. They needed freedom to pull back, counterattack, and preserve forces. Hitler refused. Cities and ports were declared fortresses once again. Cherbourg, Brest. Later, cities along the Rhine. Many of these places had little chance of relief. Allied air power made resupply nearly impossible. Still, the orders stood. For the soldiers inside these cities, the experience was hauntingly familiar. Short rations, no replacements, endless bombardment, retreat forbidden. The psychological toll was immense. Men fought not because victory was possible, but because surrender or withdrawal meant disobedience. And disobedience, under the Nazi system, carried its own terror. At its core, Hitler's insistence on holding cities at all costs came from a deep misunderstanding of modern war. He believed willpower could replace logistics. He believed symbolism outweighed flexibility. He believed that by standing firm, reality would bend. But war does not bend that way. Ammunition does not appear because a leader demands it. Food does not arrive because a city has a powerful name. There was also an ideological layer. Hitler saw himself as a figure chosen by history. He believed setbacks were tests, not warnings. Every crisis was a moment where faith would be rewarded. This made compromise impossible. Retreat felt like betrayal of destiny. And so cities became altars where armies were sacrificed in the hope that fate would intervene. As the war dragged into its final year, this obsession only intensified. Berlin itself would eventually be ordered held to the last. No evacuation, no surrender. The pattern repeated one final time. On the largest scale imaginable. Supply collapsed, roads choked with refugees, fuel ran dry. Yet the order echoed through the ruins. Hold, hold, hold. The tragedy is not just in the scale of loss, but in its predictability. Again and again, experienced officers explained what would happen if cities were held without supply. Again and again, it happened exactly that way. And still, the orders did not change, because by then, holding cities was no longer about winning the war. It was about denying reality itself. And this is where the story deepens, where fear, pride, and obsession fully merge. Because to understand why these orders continued even as defeat became certain, you have to step inside Hitler's mind during the final years of the war. You have to understand what holding a city meant to him when everything else was falling apart. As the war moved into 1944, the map on Hitler's wall no longer showed bold arrows pushing forward. It showed red lines closing in. The borders of the Reich were no longer distant. They were close, personal, and threatening. And as that pressure increased, Hitler's obsession with holding cities hardened into something darker. It was no longer only about military logic or even symbolism. It became about control. When everything else slipped from his hands, the power to say "hold" was one of the few things he still possessed. By this stage, Hitler rarely visited the front. His world shrank to conference rooms, bunkers, and situation maps. Reports came in filtered, delayed, and often softened by officers afraid to tell the full truth. When bad news did reach him, he reacted with anger, not analysis. A city lost was not a lesson. It was an insult. In his mind, commanders who withdrew had failed a moral test. They had chosen safety over sacrifice, and sacrifice to Hitler was proof of loyalty. This thinking poisoned decision-making on every front. On the Eastern Front in 1944, entire German armies were destroyed not because they lacked courage, but because they were forbidden to move. When Soviet offensives broke through, German units were ordered to hold cities that had no fuel, no reserves, and no realistic supply routes. Rail lines were cut within hours. Air supply was impossible under Soviet air superiority. Still, the orders remained unchanged. Hold fast. Become a fortress. Die where you stand. You can almost feel the helplessness of commanders on the ground. They could see encirclement forming on their maps. They knew the roads that might still be open for a day, maybe two. They knew that if they moved now, they could save thousands of lives. But they also knew that acting without permission meant defying Hitler directly. Careers, families, even survival depended on obedience. Many chose silence. Others delayed. By the time permission was requested, it was already too late. In the West, the same pattern repeated after the Allied landings in Normandy. Hitler believed ports were the key. If ports were held, he thought, the Allies could not sustain their advance. So he declared several ports fortresses. They were to be defended regardless of isolation. Allied forces did not always need to take these cities immediately. They simply surrounded them and moved on. The garrisons inside were neutralized without being destroyed at first. Supplies ran out. Morale collapsed. Entire divisions were effectively erased from the war, trapped behind enemy lines because they were ordered not to move. This revealed a brutal irony. Hitler believed holding cities would tie down enemy forces. In reality, it often tied down German forces instead. While Allied armies advanced rapidly, German troops sat uselessly inside isolated strongholds, waiting for relief that would never come. Flexibility was gone. Initiative was gone. What remained was stubborn endurance, detached from any larger plan. As losses mounted, Hitler's language changed. He began to speak less about victory and more about proving worth. Cities were to be held to show the world that Germany would not break. Even defeat, in his mind, could be turned into a moral statement. If cities fell only after total destruction, boy, he believed history would judge Germany as heroic, not beaten. This mindset made compromise impossible. Surrender was shame. Withdrawal was weakness. Destruction was acceptable. Inside these doomed cities, soldiers sensed the truth long before Berlin did. Letters home became quieter. Diaries spoke of waiting rather than fighting. Ammunition was counted carefully. Food was stretched thinner each day. The enemy was no longer the only threat. Hunger, cold, and disease became constant companions. Still, the radio orders never changed. Hold, stand fast, do not retreat. By late 1944, even Hitler's closest advisers understood the war was lost, yet the fortress orders continued. In some cases, they became even stricter. Civilians were forbidden to evacuate cities marked for defence. Bridges were blown prematurely. Infrastructure was destroyed to deny it to the enemy, even if it meant harming Germany's own future. The logic was no longer military. It was emotional. If Germany could not win, it would not yield easily. This reached its final and most tragic expression in 1945. As Allied armies crossed the Rhine and Soviet forces closed in from the east, Hitler declared city after city to be held. Many of these places had no real defensive value. What they shared was proximity to Berlin. Each one was treated as a shield, as if stubborn resistance could somehow slow the inevitable. Inside Berlin itself, the pattern repeated one last time. Supplies were almost non-existent. Fuel was gone. Ammunition was scarce. Yet evacuation was restricted. Surrender was forbidden. The city was ordered to hold, not because it could be saved, but because letting it go meant admitting final defeat. Hitler chose symbolic defiance over the lives of those still inside. When the end finally came, it did not come with a breakthrough or a dramatic reversal. It came with silence. Orders went unanswered. Units ceased to exist. Cities fell not because defenders stopped fighting, but because there was nothing left to fight with. The strategy of holding at all costs collapsed under the weight of its own logic. Looking back, it is clear that Hitler's insistence on holding cities regardless of supply was not a single decision, but a habit of thought that hardened over time. It began as fear of retreat. It grew into obsession with symbolism. It ended as denial of reality. Each stage made the next more extreme. The tragedy is that many German soldiers fought bravely and competently. And they were not defeated by lack of courage. They were defeated by orders that ignored how war actually works. Cities cannot be defended by belief alone. Armies cannot survive on promises. When movement is forbidden and reality is denied, even the strongest positions become prisons. In the end, the command to hold at all costs did not preserve Germany. It accelerated its destruction. It turned cities into graves. It sacrificed armies for symbols. And it revealed a truth that modern war makes unavoidable. No leader, no matter how powerful, can command reality to obey. And that is why, in the frozen streets, the ruined ports, and the shattered capitals of the Second World War, the echo of that order still lingers. Hold the city, at all costs. A sentence that sounds strong. A sentence that feels decisive. And a sentence that, time after time, has led only to silence. If you want more content like this, subscribe now and comment below.